Welcome to Your Story Radio, where history breathes, faith stirs, and the most powerful stories come alive. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to step into the most sacred moments in human history? What if playing Jesus wasn't just a role, but a doorway into something deeper, something unexplainable? Today, we take you behind the scenes of The Chosen, to a moment that changed everything for the man who portrayed Christ, and for everyone around him. The ancient stones of Matera, Italy, glistened beneath the relentless Mediterranean sun, as the cast and crew of The Chosen prepared for another grueling day of filming crucifixion scenes. Jonathan Roumie stood still, dressed in the tattered robes of Jesus' sweat dripping down his brow, not just from the heat, but from the crushing emotional weight of the scenes they had been filming. For 2 weeks, the team had called this sacred city home, shooting in the very cliffs and cave dwellings once used in the Passion of the Christ. The atmosphere was more than cinematic, it was spiritual, overwhelming, and raw. But what happened next, during what should have been a routine lunch break, would leave the entire production stunned and forever alter Jonathan's relationship with the role he thought he knew. That morning had been especially intense. Multiple takes of Jesus carrying the heavy wooden cross down the narrow, time-worn stone alleys of Matera left Jonathan physically exhausted. But it wasn't just the burden of the prop, it was the emotional toll. Day after day, he was reliving the final agonizing moments of Christ's life. Each take chipped away at his composure. Each scene demanded more. Director Dallas Jenkins finally called for a break after filming a gut-wrenching sequence, Jesus collapsing beneath the weight of the cross. The cast and crew scattered, retreating into pockets of shade among the sun-bleached buildings, all trying to escape the searing heat and the spiritual heaviness that clung to the air. Have you ever stepped so deep into a story that it starts becoming your own? What happens when the lines between acting and reality dissolve and something divine, something beyond the camera, enters the space? Before them, Matera stretched like a living painting, its labyrinth of caves and stone dwellings echoing with thousands of years of history. Filmmakers had long been drawn to this place, but for The Chosen, it was more than scenery. It was sacred ground. Each stone, each shadow seemed to whisper of ancient pain, ancient purpose. These were the final days of filming the most emotionally demanding scenes of the entire series, the final hours of Jesus' earthly ministry. Every day presented a new spiritual challenge. Every line, every look, every tear carried the weight of eternal meaning. Jonathan had prepared for this. He had prayed for this. As a Catholic whose faith had deepened through portraying Christ, he knew the responsibility he carried. Over the years, this role had reshaped his relationship with God. But even that didn't prepare him for Matera, for what he would feel here. From day one, the shoot had been punishing. Jenkins had warned everyone season 6 would be unlike anything they'd ever filmed. The sun was merciless, often climbing over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the material devastating. The kind of content that didn't just exhaust you, it haunted you. Elizabeth Tabish, who played Mary Magdalene, had cried more than once while watching Jonathan perform. Sometimes it felt less like watching an actor and more like witnessing something holy. That Tuesday morning had begun with scenes in Pilate's courtyard, Jesus being mocked by Roman soldiers. Jonathan gave it everything: the humiliation, the silence, the sorrow. The makeup team had covered him in blood and bruises so real it was hard to look at him without flinching. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, he didn't just look like a man who had been beaten and humiliated. He felt like one. Lunch was set up in a shaded courtyard, nestled between stone buildings, where catering tables overflowed with rustic Italian food. Normally, Jonathan would use this time to reflect, to pray, to retreat into stillness after the emotional chaos of each scene. But today, something felt different. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a weight he couldn't shake, as if the story they were telling was no longer just being reenacted. It was being lived. He sat in silence, absently pushing his food around the plate, barely tasting a bite. The weight of the morning's scenes still pressed heavily on Jonathan Roumie's spirit, like a stone he couldn't set down. The courtyard buzzed with the usual murmur of lunchtime chatter. But for Jonathan, everything felt distant, like the world had dimmed just a little. George Xanthus, who played John the Apostle, slid onto the bench beside him, his brow furrowed in concern as he studied his friend's pale expression. "You doing okay, man?" he asked gently. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world today." Jonathan offered a weak smile, grateful for the friendship, but struggling to articulate the strange burden on his heart. "It's just intense," he murmured, his voice quiet, almost hollow. "Every day we're here, it feels more real, like we're not just telling the story anymore. We're stepping into something sacred." Elizabeth Tabish, still in her Mary Magdalene costume, approached with her tray and settled across from them. Her face, usually warm with optimism, now mirrored the weariness they all felt. "The heat's brutal today," she said, glancing up at the midday sun. "But Jonathan, you look worse than the rest of us. You okay? Maybe sit out the next scene?" Jonathan didn't respond right away. His eyes were locked on the ancient stones of the courtyard walls, their weathered faces seeming to pulse with memory. The story they were telling, the suffering, the sacrifice, it wasn't fiction here. It lived in the very dust beneath their feet. Moments later, Dallas Jenkins walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. The director had known Jonathan for years, now watched him evolve, not just as an actor, but as a man of faith. "Hey, buddy," Dallas said, placing a hand on the back of the bench. "How you holding up? I know these scenes are rough, but you've been incredible." Jonathan blinked slowly, as if pulled from a deep place within. He looked at Dallas, but his expression held a strange stillness. "I'm fine," he said. But there was no strength behind the words. Then, almost to himself, he added, "It just feels like I'm not acting anymore, like I'm actually there." Dallas nodded, quietly, moved. He'd seen this happen before, actors reaching deep, giving everything. But something about Jonathan today felt different. "That's what makes your performance so powerful," the director said softly. "But remember, you're human too. Don't forget to take care of yourself." Jonathan nodded. The words registered but didn't seem to take hold. A few minutes later, he quietly excused himself and walked to a secluded corner of the courtyard, away from the buzz of the crew, from the weight of friendly eyes. He needed to breathe, to pray, to find himself again. The scenes ahead would be the most harrowing yet depictions of Christ's final moments on the cross. Jonathan had always prayed before difficult scenes, grounding himself in faith before stepping into the pain. This time was no different. At first, he closed his eyes and bowed his head, whispering the same words he had whispered so many times for strength, for clarity, for reverence. But something shifted. The noise of the courtyard faded. The dry heat on his skin seemed to lift. A stillness fell not just around him, but within him. Time slowed. His breathing slowed. And in that moment of absolute quiet, a peace descended unlike anything he had ever known, not on set, not in life. Vanessa Benavente, who portrayed Mary, the mother of Jesus, happened to be walking nearby when she noticed something strange. Jonathan wasn't moving. His eyes were still closed, his face unusually pale despite the midday sun. At first, she thought he was deep in prayer. But then he swayed. "Jonathan," she called gently. No response. "Jonathan." She repeated, a note of alarm creeping into her voice. Still nothing. His body was unnaturally still, his expression slack, almost trance-like. Alarmed, she turned toward the courtyard. "Dallas George, something's wrong with Jonathan?" Her voice pierced the lunch chatter like a warning bell. Dallas Jenkins dropped his sandwich, instantly bolting toward the corner. Cast and crew scrambled to follow. Within seconds, a cluster formed around Jonathan's unmoving figure. He stood, frozen in place, eyes closed, skin ghost white. His breathing had turned shallow, barely visible. "Jonathan, can you hear me?" Dallas asked, reaching out to gently shake his shoulder. No response. And then his body gave way. He collapsed backward without warning. George lunged forward, catching him just before his head hit the stone ground. The sound of someone shouting for the medic echoed across the courtyard. "Call an ambulance," Dallas shouted, already crouched beside him. Panic spread through the lunch area like wildfire. The man they had all leaned on the anchor of their production was now unconscious in their arms. The cast formed a worried circle, stunned and silent. Within seconds, the on-set medic arrived and dropped to his knees, checking Jonathan's pulse, his breathing, his vitals. But no one spoke. All they could do was watch and wait. "His pulse is steady but weak," the medic announced. "He's breathing, but unresponsive." Jonathan lay still in George's arms, his chest rising and falling in slow, shallow rhythms. There was a strange serenity to his face, almost peaceful. Yet the sight sent waves of fear through those gathered around. His costume, still stained and torn from the brutal morning scenes, only heightened the sense of unease. With fake blood smeared across his forehead and bruises darkening his skin, he looked hauntingly like the crucified Christ. Elizabeth Tabish dropped to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her voice trembled as she looked up at Dallas. "He was just praying," she whispered. He stepped away like he always does. He was praying. The irony struck everyone at once, heavy and inescapable. The man portraying Jesus had collapsed while preparing to film the crucifixion in prayer, and it didn't feel like a coincidence. All around them, the ancient stones of Matera stood silent, watching, bearing witness, as if the very city remembered pain and resurrection. Moments later, the wail of sirens pierced the afternoon air. Echoes bounced through the narrow streets as an ambulance wound its way toward the set. The paramedics moved quickly, professionally, checking vitals, speaking in hushed Italian, preparing Jonathan for transport. Dallas stood back, torn between worry and disbelief. He made the call without hesitation. Filming was suspended for the rest of the day. Nothing mattered more than Jonathan's well-being. The cast looked on in stunned silence as their friend was gently lifted onto a stretcher. Cameras were forgotten, lines and lighting plans discarded. All eyes were on Jonathan. Then, just as the ambulance doors were about to close, his eyes fluttered open. He blinked, disoriented, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling of the ambulance, then turned to the medic beside him. "What happened?" he asked, his voice fragile, barely audible. "You collapsed," the lead paramedic explained. "We're taking you to the hospital for evaluation. You're safe." Jonathan nodded slowly, trying to ground himself in the moment. Everything felt distant, as if he was slowly returning from someplace else. He remembered praying. He remembered peace. And then, nothing. Or rather, something, but not of this world. The ride to the hospital was quiet. Jonathan stared out the window, lost in thought. He hadn't simply fainted. He knew that much. What he'd felt, what he'd seen or experienced, was not physical exhaustion. It was something deeper, a place that felt truer than anything he had ever known. But now the memory was fading, like a dream slipping through his fingers. At the hospital, doctors ran every test they could: blood work, EKG scans. They checked for heat stroke, cardiac issues, even neurological irregularities. The results? Nothing. "Physically, you're in excellent health," the attending physician told him. "There's no sign of dehydration, no trauma, no abnormalities in your heart, blood pressure, or brain activity. Medically speaking, there's no explanation for what happened." An hour later, Dallas Jenkins and several cast members arrived, their expressions tight with concern. The moment Dallas stepped into the hospital room, Jonathan sat up a little straighter in bed, trying to reassure him. But the look in his eyes told a different story. "How are you feeling?" Dallas asked, cautiously hopeful. Jonathan let out a breath. "Honestly, I feel fine now." Then he paused, his voice quieting. "But Dallas, something happened out there. And I don't think it was just exhaustion." The room fell still. "It wasn't like fainting," Jonathan continued. "And it wasn't just the heat. It was something else." His voice carried both awe and confusion, as if he was still trying to convince himself it was real. The doctor quietly stepped out, leaving them alone. Jonathan looked from face to face, Dallas, George, Elizabeth, each waiting, listening. "When I was praying," he said slowly, "I felt this overwhelming peace. Not just emotional something, total. But then it was like I wasn't in Matera anymore. I don't know how to describe it. I was somewhere else." His voice faltered. "It felt more real than this," he said at last. "More real than anything I've ever felt." George and Elizabeth exchanged glances. They knew Jonathan's faith ran deep. But this was something beyond. Can you describe it? Dallas asked gently. The filmmaker in him was fascinated, but more than that, he was concerned for his friend. Jonathan closed his eyes, searching for the vision, for the memory, but it slipped away like sand between his fingers. It's hard to explain, he said. It felt like I was being shown something sacred, something holy, a glimpse of something beyond what we can see or understand. Elizabeth reached out, placing her hand gently on his. We were so scared, she said softly. You looked so peaceful, but we couldn't wake you. You wouldn't respond. Jonathan turned to her and squeezed her hand, his expression full of something undefinable. I remember feeling safe, he said, more safe than I've ever felt in my life. Like I was being held by something infinite, loving, powerful. Words failed to capture what Jonathan Roumie had experienced. How could they? How do you explain the unexplainable when your spirit is touched in a way that bypasses the mind entirely? As evening fell over Matera, the incident on set had already become more than just a production delay. Whispers of what happened spread through the local film community like a quiet storm. Then beyond, into fan groups, prayer circles, and message boards around the world. Devoted viewers of The Chosen began lifting prayers for Jonathan's recovery, unaware that his body was already healed. But his soul was still unraveling something far deeper. The city itself seemed to hold its breath that night. The ancient stones of Matera, witnesses to centuries of suffering and salvation, stood in quiet reverence as the cast and crew tried to process what had occurred. During what should have been an ordinary lunch break, alone in his hospital bed under the dim glow of sterile lights, Jonathan lay wide awake. His body was calm, but his mind stirred with images, impressions, feelings that refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, fragments of that mysterious experience came back, some clear, some fleeting like smoke in his hands. He hadn't seen a vision, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't an image he would later tell Dallas. It was being touched by truth itself, by love itself. And if you're still here, witnessing this incredible moment, when heaven seemed to touch earth right in the middle of a film set, if you believe that God still moves in ways science can't explain, go ahead and like this video and comment the word encounter below. Let's see how many of us still believe that the divine can break into the ordinary turning stone courtyards and camera sets into sacred ground. By morning, doctors had cleared Jonathan to return to the hotel. They had found no physical reason to keep him. No illness, no trauma, just stillness. Before he left, the attending physician approached him, still mystified. In my 20 years of medicine, he admitted, I've never seen anything quite like what happened to you. Your body just stopped. No medical cause, no warning. He paused. Maybe some experiences go beyond what we can measure. Back at the hotel, the cast gathered in Jonathan's room. The mood was gentle, uncertain. Dallas had already told the team he'd halt production for as long as needed. But Jonathan met them with a calm determination. I feel more ready than ever, he said softly. Whatever happened yesterday, It gave me a deeper understanding of what we're doing here. There was something new in his eyes, a stillness, a clarity, not exhaustion revelation, but "Are you sure you're up for filming the crucifixion scenes?" George asked, his voice edged with concern. "Those are going to be the most intense yet." Jonathan nodded. "I think yesterday was preparation," he replied. "I can't fully explain it, but I've been given a gift, a connection deeper than before." The others were moved, but still hesitant. What they'd seen the day before had shaken them, and yet Jonathan's conviction was steady. That afternoon, despite quiet protests, he returned to set. The crew watched him like hawks, scanning for signs of distress. But instead, they saw something different, something radiant. Jonathan moved with a quiet confidence. His steps were slow, deliberate, not from weakness, but from purpose. His face, though still marked by makeup bruises and blood, seemed to glow with an inner light. "I'm okay," he assured anyone who asked. "More than okay." He smiled gently. "Something beautiful happened yesterday, even if I can't put it into words." Before filming resumed, Dallas pulled him aside. They stood in the shade near the edge of the set where stone and silence met. "Look," Dallas began, "I don't pretend to understand what happened to you yesterday, but I saw it, and I see it now. Whatever it was, it's changed you. And if you need time or space or anything, we'll wait." Jonathan placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Dallas, in all the years we've made this show, have you ever felt like we were doing more than just telling a story?" he asked quietly. "Like we were touching something sacred." Dallas didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, "Many times," he said. "But what happened to you yesterday? It felt like the sacred touched back." The silence that followed said more than either of them could, and when the cameras rolled again, everyone felt it. Jonathan's performance had always been powerful, but now there was something else, a depth, a presence, a tenderness and pain that ran soul deep. Something had changed, and everyone on set could feel it. It's like he's drawing from some well of experience that wasn't there before Elizabeth whispered to George during a brief break between takes. And she was right. The camera had captured it, not just the agony of Christ, but something ineffable in Jonathan Roumie's eyes, a peace that transcended pain, a stillness that went beyond performance. There was something holy radiating from him, and everyone saw it. Word of Jonathan's mysterious collapse and his even more mysterious recovery was now spreading through the Christian film community and beyond. Devoted fans of The Chosen began posting testimonies of their own spiritual encounters, while watching the show, sparking conversations online about divine presence miracles and the unseen work of God. "Maybe this is how God moves," one fan posted, "through people who are willing to be used for something greater than themselves." As the days passed, Jonathan began to realize just how deeply his experience had changed him. He was still discovering it, still unwrapping the layers of what had happened. But the effects were undeniable. His prayer life became richer. His connection to the role of Jesus grew more profound. And through every brutal, emotionally draining scene, he carried an unshakable peace, a peace that stayed no matter how dark the moment. "I can't explain what happened," he told his wife during a video call that evening, his voice soft, eyes shining. "But I know it was real, and I know it was from God." The cast felt it too. "There's something different about him," Vanessa confided quietly to Elizabeth. "Not bad, different, beautiful, different. Like he's been touched by something holy." They had all grown spiritually since joining The Chosen. It was unavoidable when you spent years bringing sacred scripture to life. But what Jonathan had experienced felt like something more, something rare, like an anointing or an invitation into something sacred. Dallas Jenkins, ever mindful of the delicate balance between art and ministry, made the decision to briefly acknowledge the event in his regular update to fans. One of our cast members experienced something powerful during filming, he wrote. "It's deepened both his faith and his performance. We ask for your continued prayers, and we're so grateful that you're walking this journey with us." The response was overwhelming. Thousands of fans flooded social media with messages of prayer, encouragement, and personal stories. Times when The Chosen had been more than just a show to them. For many, it had been a spiritual turning point. By Thursday, Jonathan felt ready to speak about his experience more openly. That evening, the cast and crew gathered in the hotel's quiet lounge, a space that had become their sanctuary away from set. Jonathan stood before them, nervous but steady, and began to share. "I don't want to claim I had some grand vision," he said carefully. "But I know without a doubt that God met me that day, and not just gently. It was overwhelming. It was like being loved by love itself, if that makes any sense." The room was silent, transfixed. George, who had caught Jonathan when he collapsed, sat forward in his seat, visibly moved. As someone who's played John, the disciple Jesus loved, he said, "I can only imagine what it must be like to actually feel that love." Everyone grew quiet again. The air was thick with something unspoken, a reverence. Jonathan took a breath. "What I can say," he continued, "is that it's changed everything about how I approach this role. Before, I was trying to portray Jesus intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. But now, I feel like I've been given a tiny glimpse of what it might actually be like. That connection with the Father, it's not something I'm just performing anymore. I'm experiencing it." The weight of his words settled into the room like a sacred hush. Elizabeth wiped away tears. Her voice cracked gently as she spoke. "We've all been changed by this show. Every one of us. But what you experienced, it's like God is using you to show us something more, something of Himself." They spent the rest of the evening in quiet prayer and reflection, feeling drawn together, not just as artists, but as witnesses to something divine. This wasn't just a production anymore. They were a part of something holy. And as the week drew to a close and filming resumed, that sense of reverence lingered. The set didn't feel the same. Crew members moved with intention. Wardrobe changes, makeup touch-ups, lighting corrections, they all happened as before. But now, each task felt like a sacred offering. They weren't just recreating a story, they were documenting truth. It's like we're not just making a show about Jesus, one of the camera operators murmured during a quiet moment on set. It's like Jesus is making a show through us. No one argued. In the days that followed Jonathan Roumie's mysterious experience, the crucifixion scenes carried a weight unlike anything the crew had ever captured. Take after take, his performance reached into a space that defied explanation. It wasn't just pain or acting or even faith. It was as if something eternal was flowing through him. I've never seen anything like it, the cinematographer told Dallas Jenkins, still visibly shaken after reviewing the dailies. It's like he's channeling something beyond himself, like the cameras picking up the sacred. By the time filming wrapped in Matera, the entire crew knew they had been part of something more than just another season. They'd made the chosen, yes, but they'd also witnessed something divine. The ancient stones of that Italian city, weathered by centuries of history, had now borne silent witness to what many on set believed would be the most powerful season yet. A season not just about Christ's passion, but infused with his presence. On their final night in Matera, Jonathan returned alone to the courtyard. The same place where it had all happened. The place where days earlier he had collapsed under a peace so profound it had taken him out of time itself. He stood quietly breathing in the evening air. The stars above were ancient, the stones beneath him older still. "I don't understand what you did for me here," he whispered aloud, eyes closed. "But I know it was a gift. Help me honor it." And once again, that peace returned. Familiar now, comforting. This time, though, he remained fully conscious, present in both body and spirit. The flight home to the US was quiet. The cast sat in hushed conversation or personal reflection, each of them processing the spiritual atmosphere they'd lived through in Italy. Jonathan stared out the window. Most of the journey, his heart still unraveling the mystery. He knew he had been changed. But the depths of that change, he was only just beginning to understand. Back in the States, news of what had happened in Matera began circulating in Christian media circles. Rumors of Jonathan's collapse and encounter quickly led to a flood of interview requests. Podcasts, Christian outlets, YouTube channels, and faith networks all wanted to hear the story from him directly. But Jonathan declined nearly all of them. What happened wasn't for headlines, he explained to Dallas. Some things are meant to be treasured in the heart, not broadcast to the world. He wasn't being secretive, just protective, reverent. When he did speak about the event, he chose his words carefully. "I don't pretend to understand what happened," he said in one quiet conversation. "I just know that God met me, and it changed how I see everything." His humility only deepened the impact of the story. Fellow actors in the Christian film world reached out not with curiosity but with empathy. Many had their own stories of sensing God's presence during spiritually demanding roles. "There's something about portraying Jesus," one veteran actor told him, that opens us up in ways we never expected. But what happened to you? That sounds like something beyond. Jonathan appreciated the conversations, but kept the most sacred details to himself. Meanwhile, Dallas and the editing team began their post-production work on season 6. But something had shifted. There was a mission behind every cut, every shot. We all felt it, Dallas told his team. On set, in the air, in Jonathan. We need to make sure the audience can feel it too. And the footage from Matera, especially the crucifixion scenes, carried more than just drama. It carried presence, the sacred. As whispers of the story continued to circulate, even theologians and spiritual directors reached out. They wanted to understand what Jonathan had experienced, to study it, analyze it. But Jonathan declined those requests too. If you try to explain it, you'll shrink it, he told his wife one evening. The beauty of it is that it doesn't need to be understood. Just received. That truth stayed with him. And as promotional interviews for season 6 began, Jonathan spoke more openly, not about his collapse, but about the journey. My years playing Jesus have taught me something new every day, he said. About grace, about love, about what it means to follow Christ. And every time I step into this role, I feel a little more like I'm stepping into that truth too. He wasn't trying to impress or inspire. He was simply telling the truth. And maybe that's why it resonated so deeply, because this wasn't just a story about filming Jesus. It was about following him wherever he chose to lead. And sometimes, God surprises us, not with thunder or lightning, but with something far quieter, something sacred, wrapped in mystery. The incident in Matera became a turning point, not just for Jonathan Roumie, but for everyone connected to the Chosen. What began as a physical collapse quickly became a spiritual catalyst, rippling outward through the cast, the crew, and eventually the millions who watched from afar. As news spread, fans began sharing stories of their own encounters, while watching the show. Moments of unexplainable peace, overwhelming emotion, or sudden clarity in prayer. It was as though Jonathan's experience had given them permission to speak about the divine in their lives. His moment, Dallas Jenkins observed, unlocked something in all of us. As season 6 moved through post-production, the energy around the project shifted. The footage from Matera didn't feel like typical television. It felt sacred. Between the rugged beauty of the ancient landscape, the once-in-a-lifetime performances, and the unshakable spiritual atmosphere that clung to every frame, editors and crew alike knew they weren't just putting together a show. They were curating something holy. This isn't just entertainment, one editor said softly during a late-night session. This is ministry. When asked directly about what he believed happened that day in Matera, Jonathan would often pause. Not out of uncertainty, but reverence. I think God wanted to remind me, he'd say quietly, and maybe remind others through me, that he's not just a character in the story we're telling. He's alive. He's present. And he still touches lives in ways that go beyond our understanding. The conviction in his voice was unmistakable, and the mystery of it all remained just that, a mystery. Despite extensive tests, top-tier doctors, and full evaluations, there was no medical reason for Jonathan's sudden collapse. No diagnosis, no warning signs, nothing. Sometimes Jonathan reflected, the best explanations are the ones we can't prove in a lab. The impact of his experience wasn't isolated. It became a spark igniting something in the hearts of those around him. George Xanthis, who had caught Jonathan's body that day before it hit the stone, found his own faith deepened in the days that followed. If God can touch Jonathan that directly, he said, maybe he's closer to all of us than we realize. The moment created a ripple, a quiet spiritual awakening that moved through the cast like a soft breeze through an olive grove. No one could deny it. Something had shifted. Walls had lowered. Hearts had opened. A week passed. Jonathan, still humbled and changed, no longer felt the need to analyze what had happened. Some gifts from God aren't meant to be figured out, he told Dallas on a phone call. They're meant to be lived. That simple truth became his peace. When production updates were later shared with the chosen fan community, the response was staggering. Thousands of fans flooded the comments with their own testimonies. Stories of tears during episodes of prayers, answered mid-scene of lives, quietly changed in the glow of a screen. Jonathan's experience, Dallas said, is giving people language for their own encounters with God. And for Jonathan, the role he had once called the opportunity of a lifetime began to take on an even deeper meaning. Playing Jesus, he reflected, was already the greatest honor I could imagine. But now I understand it's also a responsibility, a call to stay open, to let God work through this story, through this role, through all of us. And that weight didn't feel like pressure. It felt like purpose. As season 6 moved toward final cuts, the entire team approached their work with fresh eyes and humbled hearts. We're not just editing scenes, one lead editor whispered in the dark studio room. We're stewarding something sacred that happened in Matera, from the timing of Jonathan's collapse to the inexplicable peace that followed, from the invisible shift on set to the emotional resonance in the footage. There was no denying it. Something had happened, something real, something holy. Jonathan's experience became more than a moment. It became a defining chapter in the life of the chosen itself, and it seemed to affirm what many had quietly suspected for years. This show isn't just a show, it's a vessel, and through it, God is still reaching hearts, still stirring souls, still writing stories that only heaven could explain. Maybe Jonathan was right when he later joked, maybe my collapse was just God's way of getting everyone's attention. What happened that day in the sunlit courtyard of Matera was never explained. And maybe it wasn't meant to be. Jonathan stopped trying to analyze it. He stopped searching for answers. Instead, he chose to let the experience be a gift, a touch from the divine, a whisper from God, a reminder that His presence isn't distant or symbolic. It's real, and it's here. Some of the most important things in life, Jonathan said one evening, are the ones we can't fully understand. As word spread that season 6 of The Chosen had completed filming, buzz echoed through the entertainment world. But this wasn't ordinary hype. This wasn't marketing. There was reverence in the voices of executives who had heard about Jonathan's collapse and the sacred intensity of those crucifixion scenes. "This isn't just television," one producer whispered. "This is something else entirely." Back home, in quiet moments of reflection, Jonathan found himself returning to prayer this time with a confidence that hadn't been there before. "Prayer feels different now," he told his spiritual director. "It's no longer talking to God like he's far away. It's conversation with someone who's right here." The ripple effect of Jonathan's experience extended beyond the walls of The Chosen. Other filmmakers in the Christian world took notice. Writers, directors, actors began approaching their work with new eyes, with greater reverence. Jonathan's story reminded us, one filmmaker said, "We're not just making movies about God. We're inviting God into the process." Still, as the days passed, Jonathan realized something profound. The memory of the experience stayed vivid, but impossible to dissect. "It's like trying to explain the color blue to someone who's never seen color," he said. "You know it's real, but the words always fall short." That used to frustrate him. But now, it only deepened the wonder. Matera itself seemed changed. When the crew returned for a few pickup shots, several people reported an undeniable sense of sacredness still lingering in the air, in the stones, in the silence. "That city has seen so much history," Elizabeth Tabish said quietly. "But now, it's seen a miracle too." As news of Jonathan's collapse spread further, people began to reach out, asking for prayer, hoping to experience something similar. But he never let it become about him. "This wasn't something I achieved," he told one woman gently. "It was a gift. God meets us each in our own time, in His own way." And as editors combed through the footage from Matera, even the technical team's people who hadn't been present during the shoot were moved to tears. "There's something in every frame," Dallas told them. "Something that goes beyond performance, beyond camera angles or lighting. It's presence." What had happened in Matera couldn't be captured fully in a headline or documentary. But somehow, the spirit of it lived in the footage. Jonathan's willingness to speak honestly without claiming full understanding gave others the courage to share their own experiences. Sometimes, he said in an interview, the most powerful testimony is just saying, "God is real and He's here." As the 1-week mark of his collapse approached, Jonathan spent time in solitude, praying not for clarity but for wisdom. "I don't want to make too much of what happened," he prayed. "But I don't want to make too little of it either." That balance between humility and testimony would define his walk from now on. Even the medical team who had treated him remained mystified. No diagnosis, no underlying issues, no reason at all. In 20 years, one physician told a colleague, "I've never seen anything like it." When medicine has no answers, sometimes we have to admit something beyond medicine might be at work. Jonathan wasn't the only one. Other actors who had portrayed Jesus reached out, sharing their own moments of strange peace or spiritual weight. There's something about playing him. One veteran actor wrote, that opens a door between heaven and earth, and Jonathan found comfort in that shared mystery. As season 6 neared release, the feeling was unanimous among the cast and crew. They weren't just finishing a show, they were stewarding something sacred, authentic locations, powerful performances, and a spiritual current running through it all like fire beneath the surface. This isn't a television series, cast members began saying. This is a spiritual event. 1 week after his collapse, Jonathan returned alone to the courtyard in Matera. The same stones, the same air. But now, with a heart forever changed. I may never fully understand what happened to me here, he said quietly. But I know this God is real. He is present, and He still moves in ways that take our breath away. Sometimes, the most profound encounters don't come in visions or voices. They come in stillness, in a prayer whispered beneath a Mediterranean sun, in a heart cracked open just wide enough for heaven to reach through. As the cast finally packed their things and prepared to leave Matera, they knew they weren't just carrying hard drives filled with footage. They were carrying the memory of something eternal, something that reminded them that faith isn't just something we act out, it's something we step into. And sometimes, if we're willing, it steps into us.